Migrating here in terms of my mother and father meant a fulfillment of a better life and education.
Our early days is not different from the stories you hear from newly arriving immigrants, where people share an apartment. You might have more than 4 people in an apartment.
My grandmother's sister, Doña Vicenta, brought my mother over first. They took a boat, it was called El Ponce, and it was very heart-wrenching and scary.
Following my brother's footsteps, my mother and I came to the States, and that was the first time. I was already 13 years old when I met my father for the first time.
And they all came here just like so many other generations of immigrants. The Germans came, the Irish came, the Italians came. They all came seeking opportunity for their families, and that's what these guys did.
The largest number of Puerto Ricans really arrives in the 50s. That was the period of time that's referred to as the period of the Great Migration. This migration begins in the 40s, in the post-World War II period.
Puerto Rican migration to New York in the 40s through the 1970s took a big jump. It went from about the average of 50,000 Puerto Ricans in New York City to over 800,000 Puerto Ricans in New York City, essentially spurred by the possibility of opportunity.
Many originally came from the use of ocean liners.
There was 2 ways of getting into the United States, to New York. That was by ship.
Air service really didn't become popular until after the war.
We came by plane, and it was an Air Force airplane. We were picked up by my grandmother and her friends, and we were brought over to where my grandmother lived, and we share like a 1-bedroom apartment.
Spanish is the first language of Puerto Ricans. Even though we are a U.S. territory and by birth we are U.S. citizens.
They had a very strong language identification, which was difficult to give up because the family, for the most part, was still in Puerto Rico.
So many Puerto Ricans had a critical barrier, which was the language. They did not speak English fluently.
When you come from Puerto Rico, from wherever, if you come to the States and everybody around you speaks one language, which is at the moment it was English. So either you learn or you're gonna have a rough time.
It was not easy, not knowing the language, but I eventually began to pick up on English, even though I still speak it with a heavy accent, because I never forgot my roots or my language, which is Spanish.
My father, he came here when he was already of high school age. He didn't know English, and consequently he learned it in high school through, in particular, one person, an Italian young man who was a classmate of his. They sat next to each other, and he spoke Italian, my father spoke Spanish, so they were able to communicate, and they became friends, and that's how my father learned English.
Evelina Lopez Antonetti didn't know English, but she picked it up very fast. Her thing was, I don't know English, I have to learn it, déjame tirarme.
The migration to the Bronx really begins in the post-World War II period.
We were living in an apartment, 2-room apartment, 13 people in that apartment. So it was very rough,
The Bronx at the time was a very largely middle-class borough.
In those days, you were moving up in status when you moved to the Bronx.
It started at the lower part of the Bronx, which proximity to Manhattan is where things start to grow outwards.
You can walk from northern Manhattan across the bridge into the South Bronx.
The dream of anybody that was living in New York City at the time, in any of the poorer neighborhoods, was to be able to get into one of the housing projects. It was an upscale thing.
The housing in Mott Haven and in Hunts Point was newer than you could find in East Harlem, and therefore it was better.
The Bronx saw an economic boom and a housing boom right after they decided to build subways, subway extensions, and it was the country. It was a place that many European groups, my own family included, had moved to out of Manhattan.
I still remember the wintry day It was January 8th, 1969. I was a little bambino, 8 years old. We moved to the Bronx, and we buy a row house on a dead-end street in the Northeast Bronx. And what a journey for our family. We were owning a house. It was a row house. It was simple, but it was our house. And we were all so excited. We all were going to have a bedroom. We would have a basement and a garage and a parking pad and a backyard and a balcony. It was a very exciting moment for us, and that was our foray into the Bronx.
Y el jibarito sale loco de contento con su cargamento para la ciudad.